Hello everyone. Today, I invite you to settle in for a tale that at first might sound ordinary, just a story about a lazy boy. But as with many old stories whispered through time, there is more here than meets the eye. What if I told you that sometimes laziness hides not weakness, but a different kind of strength? That beneath the surface of idleness can lie a spark of invention, waiting for the right moment to burn brightly? Tonight, we are not just listening to a fable, we are traveling into a village, stepping into the life of a boy named Ryan, and watching how misfortune transforms him. This isn't only about laziness and hard work. It is about what drives us when the world seems heavy, and why great challenges often bring forth our hidden gifts. It is about family, about survival, and about the extraordinary lengths an ordinary person can go to when everything is at stake. And as we wander through this tale, you will also find small treasures for your own journey, new words, phrases, and sentences that can strengthen your English in simple, memorable ways. Stories, after all, have always been the oldest teachers. Long before classrooms, our ancestors gathered by firelight, listening to sagas that taught them how to live, how to hope, and how to endure. So think of this not as a lesson, but as an experience. You are stepping into the dusty lanes of a small kingdom long ago, where the clatter of wooden carts mixed with the songs of farmers in the fields, where young Ryan dreamed not of greatness, but only of rest. Yet destiny was already shaping his path. By the end of this journey, you may discover, as Ryan did, that laziness can be conquered, not by force alone, but by reason, creativity, and a burning purpose. For when we care deeply enough, even the most unlikely person can astonish the world. Stay with me until the end, because you will not only hear how Ryan's cleverness saved his family, but also learn why the villagers who once mocked him later told his story for generations. And along the way, we will pause to practice a few words. As people once paused to gather meaning from proverbs, this is not just a story. It is an invitation. An invitation to reflect, to learn, and perhaps to see yourself in a boy who was once called lazy, yet proved that even the unlikeless soul can rise when destiny knocks. Once upon a time, in a modest kingdom where farmers depended on the rhythms of the sun and the mercy of the rains, there was a small village surrounded by rice fields. These fields were not just soil and grain. They were lifelines. Every stalk of rice represented days of labor. Every harvest meant food for the winter. Life here was simple, but it was also relentless dawn to dusk. Sowing, watering, harvesting, and starting all over again. On the edge of this village, in a humble wooden house with a thatched roof, lived a boy named Ryan with his parents. He was not known for strength, nor for ambition, but for something else entirely: his laziness. The villagers had many words to describe him: sluggish, idle, slow. Yet his story was more complicated than their quick judgments. Every morning, Ryan's father would take him to the fields. The work assigned to the boy was simple: chase away the birds. To the farmers, those birds were not harmless creatures. They were thieves, swooping down in flocks to pluck at the precious rice grains. Other boys in the village would run with sticks, clap their hands, or fling stones with slingshots. They shouted and scattered the sparrows, their laughter echoing across the fields. But Ryan was different. He disliked running, disliked shouting, disliked the endless scurrying. To him, work was a burden to be escaped. Yet, here lies the curious twist. While Ryan avoided physical labor, his mind did not sleep. He wanted to do less, but in order to do less, he had to think more. So one day, instead of tiring himself out like the others, Ryan cut down a few long wooden poles. He planted them across different parts of the field, then connected them with ropes and scraps of cloth. When the birds descended, all Ryan had to do was tug a rope, and suddenly the pole shook, the cloth flapped in the wind, and the entire field came alive with motion. The startled birds scattered, believing people were everywhere. And Ryan? He lay on the grass, chewing on a stalk of rice, pulling the ropes lazily as though he were playing a game. His eyes half closed, his body resting, but his fields were safe. The villagers frowned at this. Too lazy to even stand, they muttered. But his father, though worried, remained quiet. The truth was that Ryan's trick worked. The rice survived, the birds fled, and though Ryan avoided sweat, he still achieved his duty. Yet, his father's heart carried a shadow. He would often glance at Ryan and think, if I fall ill one day, if my strength leaves me, how will this boy manage? A clever rope system cannot plow the soil, cannot carry water, cannot bring in the harvest. This fear stayed with him, like a stone pressing against the chest. Still, because Ryan completed his task, however unconventionally, his father said nothing. He hoped, perhaps, that one day life itself would teach Ryan what no parent's words could. In the evenings, the village came alive with stories. Around cooking fires, elders spoke of kings and wars, of storms and blessings, of trials where strength alone was not enough. Ryan often listened, though his eyes looked half asleep. And perhaps, though no one guessed it, the seeds of those stories were quietly planting themselves in his mind. He was lazy, yes, but he was also watching, thinking, and waiting. Then, one summer, when the air hung heavy with dust and the rains failed to come, the rhythm of the village changed. What should have been the season of green stalks and glistening paddies became a season of thirst. The riverbeds cracked, the fields hardened, and the people prayed for clouds that never gathered. It was in this dry season that Ryan's father fell ill. At first it was just a cough, then fever, then a weakness that refused to leave. A man who had once swung his sickle with ease now struggled to rise from his mat. And for the first time, Ryan was no longer just a lazy boy tugging ropes. He was the only hope his family had. The work, however, was immense. The fields demanded water, but the well was far and the buckets heavy. Ryan had never carried more than he needed. Now he had to shoulder the weight of the harvest. He tried, at first. He truly did. He walked under the burning sun, his back aching, his arms trembling with each trip to the well. He bent over the crops, sweat dripping into the soil. Yet it was too much. His body, unused to toil, betrayed him. Day by day, the rice began to wither. The bright green blades turned pale, then yellow, then brown. The fields that once swayed like waves of hope now stood brittle and lifeless. Ryan's clever rope system was useless against drought. No trick could summon rain, no invention could replace labor. Each night, Ryan sat outside, staring at the stars that glittered in the black sky. He thought of the laughter of the villagers, of the way they always called him lazy. He thought of his father's silence, the silence of disappointment. And worst of all, he thought of the empty granaries that would greet his mother in the months to come. A voice inside him whispered, "Why did you never try harder? Why did you never prepare for this moment?" But regret does not water dying crops. He clenched his fists against the earth. For the first time, he felt the full weight of failure, not the harmless kind that made people laugh at him, but the kind that crushed futures, that starved families. His cleverness had always saved him before, but cleverness without effort had left him helpless now. That night, the village was quiet, save for the faint coughs of his father inside their house. Ryan looked at the heavens, his heart torn between despair and the flicker of something else resolve. He did not yet know how, but he knew he could not let this be the end of his story. And as dawn crept into the sky, painting the horizon with the faintest light, Ryan would soon hear words that would change his path forever. The morning after Ryan's night of despair began like any other in the parched village, with silence broken only by the croak of crows and the creak of buckets being lowered into nearly dry wells. Farmers shuffled about with weary faces, resigned to another day of hardship. But then, a sound pierced the stillness. Hoofbeats, steady and loud, drawing closer from the main road. Children ran to see. A soldier of the king, cloaked in dust and armor, rode into the square. His presence alone was enough to gather a crowd. Villagers dropped their tools and hurried to the center, whispering among themselves. It was rare for the king's men to appear in such small, forgotten places. The soldier dismounted, unrolled a scroll, and lifted his voice. It carried across the houses, across the fields, across every ear that strained to listen. By the order of His Majesty, the King, he declared, a great competition shall be held at the royal palace. Strength, wit, and endurance shall be tested. And to the victor, he paused, letting the suspense grow, a chest of gold shall be granted, enough to change a family's fate. The villagers gasped. Gold. Not a handful of coins, not a sack of grain, but a chest. For people who measured wealth in baskets of rice and in goats tethered outside their huts, such riches sounded almost mythical. Ryan's heart stirred. For weeks he had watched his father weaken, his crops die, and his mother's eyes grow heavy with worry. The thought flashed across his mind like lightning. This could save us. He did not think of his laziness then. He did not think of the laughter he would endure. He thought only of his family, of the harvest lost, of the granary that stood empty. I will join, he said aloud, almost before realizing it. The villagers turned to him in disbelief. Some laughed outright. Ryan? The boy who lies down to chase birds? He will compete against the strongest men of the kingdom. Their voices rang with scorn, but beneath the mockery was a sharper-edged curiosity. Ryan's parents stood apart, their faces drawn with conflict. His mother's eyes shone with worry, but his father, though sick, managed a faint smile. Perhaps, he thought, this journey would force Ryan to discover the strength he had always hidden behind excuses. Perhaps life itself had chosen this moment to shape him. The soldier looked at Ryan without expression, then announced, the palace gates open in 3 days. Those who wish to prove themselves must arrive by then. And just like that, the boy who had once been content to tug ropes from the shade found himself standing at the edge of destiny. The crowd still muttered, shaking their heads at his foolishness. Yet Ryan did not turn back. For the first time in his life, he had a reason bigger than himself. The journey would be long and the competition fierce. But within Ryan's chest, beneath years of slumbering laziness, something had finally awakened. Ryan set out the very next morning, before the sun had fully risen. His mother packed him a bundle of food, flatbread, dried fish, and a small gourd of water. She pressed it into his hands, her fingers lingering a moment longer than usual, as though the weight of her love might shield him from the unknown. His father, too weak to rise, whispered only, "Go, son. Do not return empty-handed." And so Ryan walked. The palace lay 3 days away, across forests, rivers, and winding roads. For a boy who had rarely strayed beyond the fields, every step was a venture into a world larger than he had ever imagined. The first day carried him past farmlands, much like his own, where peasants bent low over their crops, fighting against the same drought. Some glanced at him curiously as he passed. He could feel their unspoken question. What business does a thin, lazy boy have with the king's competition? But Ryan walked on, head lowered, clutching the small bundle of food at his side. By afternoon, the path grew rougher. He entered a forest where the air was thick with the songs of cicadas and the rustle of unseen creatures. Here, shade offered relief from the blazing sun, but the uneven ground tested his strength. He stumbled, heaved, and paused often. His body complained, every muscle cried for rest, but each time he thought of turning back, the image of his father coughing in bed returned to him, pushing him forward. That night he slept beneath the trees, staring at a sky pricked with stars. The forest smelled of earth and pine, and for the first time, he felt small beneath the vastness of the world. Laziness had once shrunk his life to a field and a rope. Now, necessity was pulling him into horizons he had never dared to see. On the second day, he followed the road as it wound alongside a river. Merchants passed him with ox-drawn carts, loaded with clay pots, textiles, and spices. Soldiers marched in groups, their armor clattering in rhythm. Children herded goats along the banks, waving at him with cheerful shouts. Ryan observed them all quietly. For years, his world had been limited to his parents and a few villagers. Now, he was beginning to see the greater kingdom his father had sometimes spoken of its people. Its trade, its restless energy. Hunger gnawed at him as the sun reached its peak. His bundle of food was already lighter. Each bite reminded him that survival required planning, that every choice carried consequence. In a way, his journey itself was already teaching him what laziness had hidden. The discipline of endurance taught by the third day, the road grew busier. Others were traveling toward the same destination, men with strong shoulders and confident strides, their laughter bold. Some carried ropes, others carried staffs. Competitors, Ryan felt a pang of fear. Compared to them, he was a frail shadow. His heart thumped harder with each step. And then, at last, as the sun dipped low, Ryan reached the outer gates of the capital. The sight stole his breath. Towering walls of stone, banners fluttering from the battlements, guards in gleaming armor, and beyond them, the sprawling city that pulsed with life. For a boy from a forgotten village, it was overwhelming, like stepping into the pages of the stories he had once heard by F.I. Religh. At the heart of it all, rising like a mountain of marble, stood the king's palace. Its towers caught the final rays of sunlight, glowing gold against the crimson sky. Ryan stared, his fear mingled with awe. Tomorrow, within those walls, he would face his first trial. The boy who had once chosen ropes to avoid standing now stood before destiny itself. And though his legs trembled with exhaustion, he felt something new, an ember of determination, small but unyielding, burning within him. At dawn, the palace grounds came alive with noise. Trumpets blared, drums thundered, and people from every corner of the kingdom crowded into the great courtyard. Banners snapped in the wind, their colors gleaming red and gold beneath the morning sun. This was no ordinary day. It was the day of the royal competition. Ryan stood among the contestants, his heart pounding. Around him were men who looked carved from stone, muscular farmers, hunters with broad shoulders, soldiers hardened by years of training. Some laughed with confidence, others stretched and tested their arms like athletes preparing for battle. Compared to them, Ryan felt small, his frame thin, his palms already damp with sweat. The royal herald, dressed in bright silk, stepped forward. His voice rang out across the crowd. The first trial shall test your strength and your cunning. Before you lies the great lake. To reach the far shore is your task. The first 3 to cross shall advance to the next round. The crowd roared with excitement. Ryan turned his gaze toward the lake. Its waters stretched wide, shimmering under the sun. Waves lapped against the edges like an endless challenge. He swallowed hard. He had never swum more than a few strokes in the shallow streams near his village. Against these strong men, what chance did he have? The herald raised his hand. Contestants, prepare yourselves. Ryan's chest tightened. He thought of his father, frail on the bed. He thought of his mother, hiding her tears as she cooked what little food remained. This was not just a race, it was survival. 3, 2, 1. Begin. With a deafening splash, the competitors dove into the lake. Their arms cut through the water like blades, their heads bobbing as they surged forward. The crowd cheered, pointing at the strongest swimmers, who quickly took the lead. Ryan did not move. He stood on the shore, heart racing, watching the chaos of limbs thrashing in the water. He knew instantly, if he swam, he would sink before reaching the halfway point. Then, an idea sparked. His eyes darted to the nearby forest that fringed the lake. He remembered the branches, the way wood could float, the tricks he once used in the fields. It is not a swimming race, he thought. It is a crossing. Without hesitation, Ryan dashed into the forest. The crowd jeered. Look, the lazy boy flees already. He cannot even try. But Ryan ignored them. He snapped broken branches, tore away vines, and tied them together with desperate hands. Slowly, a crude raft took shape. He dragged it back to the shore, heart hammering. The swimmers were already far ahead, their bodies slicing through the water, but Ryan pushed his makeshift raft into the lake and climbed aboard. He found a sturdy stick, dipped it into the water, and began to paddle. The raft was slow, clumsy, awkward, but it floated. Ryan's arms burned, but his strokes carried him steadily forward. He watched as the strongest men, who had sprinted across the water at first, began to tire. Their strokes slowed, their breaths grew ragged. Some even turned back, unable to continue. Ryan's raft, though ungainly, did not tire. It drifted forward, inch by inch. He passed one man, then another. The crowd's laughter turned into murmurs, then gasps. By the time he reached the middle of the lake, Ryan realized he was no longer last. Only a handful of swimmers remained ahead. His arms shook with exhaustion, his palms blistered, but he clenched his teeth and kept paddling. Finally, after what felt like hours, the raft bumped against the far shore. Ryan tumbled onto the sand, breathless, water dripping from his hair. He looked up and saw only two men had arrived before him. One, a broad-shouldered soldier. The other, a hunter with arms like tree trunks. Ryan had finished third. The herald's voice rang out. The first trial is complete. Advancing to the final round, Hadron of the Guard, Torin the hunter, and Ryan of the village. For a moment, silence. Then the crowd erupted in disbelief. The lazy boy from a nameless village had crossed the Great Lake. Not by muscle, but by wit. Ryan lay on the shore, chest heaving, a faint smile breaking across his face. For the first time in his life, he had turned his laziness into triumph. But the greatest challenge still lay ahead. The palace courtyard buzzed with anticipation the next morning. Word of the lazy boy who crossed the lake on a raft had spread like wildfire through the capital. People who had not cared about the competition before now pressed into the square, eager to witness this strange contender. Could he truly defy the odds again, or had fortune merely smiled upon him once? At the center of the courtyard, 3 massive wooden blocks were laid out, each taller than a man's waist and heavy enough to take 10 men to lift. They were not smooth, but rough-hewn from tree trunks, their bark stripped but their edges stubbornly square. Sunlight beat down on them, turning the air thick with heat. The herald stepped forward once more, his voice echoing through the hush. Contestants, your final challenge is this. Push your block 1 kilometer to the finish line, marked by the king's banner. Behind you lies a collection of tools. You may each choose one. Choose wisely, for strength alone will not see you through. Ryan's heart pounded as he scanned the tools lined up behind the blocks. Ropes coiled like snakes, long wooden poles for levers, iron hooks glinting in the sun, axes, chisels, even a small knife. The first contestant, Hadrin the soldier, wasted no time. He seized a thick rope, tied it around his block, and began to drag with all his might. His muscles bulged, veins standing out like cords, and the block groaned forward, inch by inch. The crowd roared approval. The second, Torin the hunter, paused to think, then chose a level one of the long wooden poles. He wedged it beneath his block, straining to lift one side, and slowly rocked it forward. The crowd murmured. His method was slower, but clever in its own way. Ryan, however, did not rush. He stood still, his eyes narrowed, his mind racing. I cannot match their strength, he thought. If I drag as they drag, I will collapse before I move 100 steps. I must think differently. Not with my body, but with my mind. He walked past the larger tools, ignoring the crowd's whispers. His hand reached out, not for the ropes, not for the lever, but for the smallest tool of all, the knife. Gasps rippled through the square. A knife? Voices cried. What can he do with that? Is he mad? Even the herald frowned, uncertain. But Ryan's face was calm. He knelt by his block, pressed the knife to the wood, and began to carve. Slowly, carefully, chips of wood flew. The crowd watched in confusion at first, then in dying curiosity. Minutes passed, then an hour. The soldier and the hunter had already dragged their blocks far ahead, their bodies drenched in sweat. Yet Ryan worked patiently, shaping, smoothing, cutting. Finally, his vision took form. The square block was no longer square. He had carved it into a giant, rough sphere, a wooden ball. Ryan wiped the sweat from his brow, planted his hands against the rounded surface, and pushed. The block rolled forward with surprising ease. The crowd gasped, then erupted into cheers while Ryan leaned into it, his legs straining, his arms trembling, but the ball obeyed him. Faster, smoother, easier than before. He caught up to Torn, whose lever had slowed to a crawl. He surged past Hadron, whose rope burned against his chest as he stumbled, exhausted. The crowd thundered with excitement. The lazy boy, they shouted. The boy who carved the block. Their disbelief turned into admiration as Ryan's ball gathered speed. Closer and closer he came to the finish line. The king's banner fluttered in the distance, and with one final push, Ryan rolled his wooden sphere across it. The courtyard shook with applause. Children cheered, merchants clapped, even the nobleman who had mocked him leaned forward in astonishment. Ryan, once the village boy too lazy to chase birds, had outwitted the strongest men in the kingdom. The herald raised his arms. The winner Ryan of the village. In that moment, the boy who had been scorned as idle became something else entirely. A symbol of ingenuity, a reminder that cleverness could triumph where brute strength failed. The cheers echoed so loudly, they seemed to shake the very stones of the palace walls. Villagers, merchants, and nobles alike pressed forward to glimpse the boy who had turned ridicule into victory. Mothers lifted their children high upon their shoulders so they could see, and the old men stroked their beards, nodding in reluctant respect. At the far end of the courtyard, upon a high platform draped in silk, sat the king himself. His robes shimmered in the sunlight, a golden crown resting lightly upon his brow. For most of the competition, he had watched in silence, his gaze sharp, his expression unreadable. But now, as Ryan stood breathless and trembling beside his wooden sphere, the king rose to his feet. Bring him forward, the king commanded. Guards stepped aside, and Ryan walked, his legs unsteady from both exhaustion and disbelief. Only hours ago, he had been the boy mocked for his laziness, the boy who avoided work whenever he could. Now, the eyes of an entire kingdom were upon him. The king studied him for a long moment, then spoke in a voice that carried across the square. Strength can move mountains, but strength alone is blind. What is the hand that shapes strength into power? This boy has shown us what true wisdom is: not to fight as others fight, but to see differently, to create where others only struggle. He raised his arm, and servants appeared carrying a chest bound with iron. They set it before Ryan, and with a creak, the lid was opened. Inside gleamed gold coins, piled high, catching the sunlight in dazzling brilliance. Gasps rose from the crowd. For a simple farmer's son, it was a fortune beyond imagining. Ryan's knees nearly buckled as he looked upon it. Not for himself did his heart race, but for his family, for his father who lay weak in bed, for his mother who had carried their burdens alone. With this, they would eat, they would rebuild, they would live without fear of the next drought. The king placed a hand on Ryan's shoulder. "You came to us mocked as lazy," he said. "You leave us honored as clever. Let this victory remind all. Even the smallest flame, when pressed by the wind of necessity, can burn brighter than the fiercest fire." The crowd erupted once more, but now the cries were not of mockery, they were of admiration. Farmers shouted his name. Children clapped their hands and laughed. Even the two men he had defeated, Hadrin and Torn, bowed their heads in respect. In that instant, Ryan's identity shifted forever. He was no longer simply the lazy boy. He was a boy who had dared, who had thought differently, who had triumphed where no one expected him to. His story would be carried back to every village, retold in markets and around firesides. A reminder that greatness does not always wear the face of strength. As the sun dipped low and the golden light bathed the palace, Ryan lifted his gaze to the sky. For the first time in his life, he did not feel useless or idle or mocked. He felt worthy. He felt ready. And though the chest of gold was heavy, the burden he carried was lighter than ever before. As the celebrations faded and the crowds dispersed, the memory of Ryan's victory lingered in every corner of the kingdom. His story spread faster than the royal heralds could travel, carried on the lips of traders, pilgrims, and storytellers. Soon, villagers who had once mocked him as the lazy boy spoke his name with wonder, as if they had always known there was something extraordinary about him. But beyond the gold and the applause lay something far more valuable. The lesson his life had come to symbolize. Ryan's tale revealed a truth often overlooked, that laziness is not always born of weakness. Sometimes it is born of imagination. The one who avoids work might instead spend time dreaming of easier paths, shortcuts, and clever inventions. But imagination without purpose is like a bird without wings, full of potential, but grounded. It took desperation, the illness of his father, and the weight of failure in the fields to ignite Ryan's hidden spark. The villagers began to whisper, perhaps he was never just lazy. Perhaps he was waiting for the right reason to rise. History offers many echoes of Ryan's lesson. Great inventors, philosophers, and leaders often began not as tireless workers, but as thinkers who questioned the ways of the world. Archimedes, legend tells us, was lying in his bath when he discovered the principle of buoyancy. Leonardo da Vinci filled pages with sketches, delaying projects endlessly, yet his restless mind reshaped art and science. Even in distant kingdoms, stories were told of men and women who appeared idle until the moment came when their ideas changed the world. Ryan's story, in its small and simple way, fit into that greater pattern. He proved that laziness, when paired with necessity, can transform into innovation. But he also showed something deeper, that no cleverness is enough without a strong why. His love for his family was his fire. Without it, he would never have endured the hunger of the journey, the strain of the raft, the long hours carving wood beneath the unforgiving sun. And so the moral took root, not only in his village but far beyond. If ever you feel trapped in idleness, do not despair. Seek a reason so powerful it will pull you forward when your body resists. A reason greater than yourself. A dream, a duty, a love. That is what turns reluctance into resilience, hesitation into heroism. In the quiet fields of his home, Ryan would one day return to this truth. His ropes and poles might still sway to scare the birds, but now they would no longer be symbols of laziness. They would be reminders that the mind, sharpened by necessity, can accomplish what muscle alone cannot. His story lived on because it was not simply about winning gold. It was about finding the spark that makes even the weary rise, even the lazy persevere, even the ordinary achieve the extraordinary. And so, dear listeners, the story of Ryan comes to a close. From the boy who once lay in the fields pulling ropes to chase birds, to the unlikely champion who carved a block into a sphere and rolled it to victory, his journey reminds us that every weakness can hide a hidden strength. What then can we take with us? First, that laziness is not the end of the road. It is a state of waiting for purpose, waiting for inspiration. Second, that cleverness is valuable, but it must be harnessed by determination. And third, that love, family, and dreams are often the greatest reasons we find to rise above our own limitations. Now, as promised, let us gather a few words from the story, simple but powerful, and practice them together. Lazy, meaning unwilling to work. Sentence: Ryan was called lazy, but his laziness hid a clever mind. Carve, to cut or shape something with a tool. Sentence: Ryan carved a block into a round shape, turning difficulty into possibility. Raft, a flat structure, usually of wood, used to float on water. Sentence: Instead of swimming, Ryan built a raft and paddled across the lake. Motivation, the reason or drive to act. Sentence: Ryan's motivation came from his love for his family. Victory, the act of winning. Sentence: Ryan's victory proved that wit could overcome brute strength. Repeat them aloud. Speak them slowly, then faster. Words, like tools, must be shaped and used to become strong. Just as Ryan carved his block, you carve your own learning, one word at a time. So remember this. Every time you feel tired, every time you feel like giving up, ask yourself, why? What is your reason? If the reason is strong enough, it will carry you further than you ever thought you could go. Ryan's tale is not just his. It belongs to all of us. To the dreamers, to the doubters, to those who sit still but are capable of more. Thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. And thank you for growing with this story. Until next time, keep your heart strong, your mind sharp, and your words alive.